The underground garage went silent before anyone moved. 6 Harley-Davidson engines shut down at the exact same second, and in the ringing quiet that followed, a grown man took a slow step backward. He had walked into that concrete cavern, expecting shadows and exhaust, and men who minded their own business. Instead, he found 6 pairs of eyes that had seen war, had buried friends, had held dying strangers on the side of dark highways, and had long since stopped fearing consequences. Behind the largest of those men, pressed into the crease of a worn leather vest, a barefoot 7-year-old girl in a yellow dress was shaking so badly her teeth chattered. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She simply wrapped 2 small fists into the back of that vest and pressed her forehead against the iron-hard spine of a man she had never met before tonight. And she trusted him completely, because she had nowhere else left to go. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a single story from our universe. Every week we bring you cinematic tales of unlikely protectors, broken men who find their purpose, and the children who somehow always know who the real monsters are. Drop a like on this video and tell us in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? We want to see just how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to that garage, because what happens in the next 2 hours will change everything. The Ashen Saints had not planned to be in Harrow Creek that night. That was the first thing Gideon Mercer would tell Detective Voss 3 days later, sitting in a fluorescent-lit interview room with dried blood still creased into the knuckles of his left hand and a cold cup of coffee he hadn't touched. They had not planned any of it. They were passing through. 6 men and 6 machines and a highway that cut south through 400 miles of nothing. A fuel stop. A parking structure that Rook had spotted from the street because the overhead lot was full and it was starting to sleet. That was all. But Gideon Graves Mercer had learned a long time ago that the worst nights of your life never announce themselves. They just arrive. He was 58 years old and he carried it in every part of his body. The knee that had been rebuilt twice. The 2 fingers on his right hand that didn't fully straighten anymore. The scar that ran from his left ear to his collarbone, smooth and pale as candle wax, which he never explained to anyone. His hair was the color of old iron and he wore it long enough to curl behind his ears. His beard was the same color. His eyes were a pale, washed-out gray that people rarely held for more than a few seconds. Not because they were cold, exactly, but because they were too patient. The eyes of a man who had seen enough of the world to understand that most crises arrived slowly, disguised as something ordinary, and by the time you recognized them for what they were, you were already inside them. He had been a combat engineer. 13 months in a country that had tried to kill him every single day. He had come home with those eyes and a tremor in his right hand that lasted 3 years and a marriage that lasted 18 months after that. His daughter, Maya, had been born 6 weeks premature, translucent and furious and impossibly alive. She had lived 22 years. She had been killed by a drunk driver on a Tuesday morning in February, 4 years ago, on her way to a job interview. She had been so nervous about that she'd called him twice the night before. Graves had not spoken for 11 days after the funeral. The Saints had not pushed him to. That was the thing about this club that people on the outside never understood. The Ashen Saints were not a gang. They were not an organization in any formal sense that would satisfy a prosecutor or a sociologist. They were 6 men, and at various points in the club's 12-year history, as many as 17, who had each arrived at the same crossroads separately, by different wreckage, and found that the only people who didn't require them to perform normalcy were the others who had also given up on performing it. Rook was a former Marine sniper who hadn't slept more than 4 consecutive hours since 2009. Dutch was a paramedic who had worked the night shift in 3 different cities until the accumulated weight of what he'd seen had simply broken something fundamental in the mechanism of how he processed the world. Callum was the youngest at 34, the only one who hadn't served, but he'd grown up with a father whose idea of discipline had put him in the hospital twice before he was 12. And there was a particular kind of damage that did to a person that was indistinguishable, in the body, from the damage done by shelling or a burning building. They were broken in different shapes. They fit together because of it. The parking garage at 14 Meridian Street in Harrow Creek was a 4-level concrete structure that smelled of motor oil and the particular damp cold of enclosed spaces in early December. The sleet had started thin and dry, rattling against the corrugated metal panels above the entrance ramp like someone dragging a key along a fence. Graves had led them down to the second level, out of the weather, and they had just killed their engines when he heard it. Not a sound exactly. A stillness within a sound. The low, controlled breathing of someone who was trying very hard not to be heard. His hand was off his keys before his mind had fully processed what his instincts already knew. He turned slowly, the way he had learned to move in confined spaces. No sudden shifts, no telegraphing. And he found her. She was standing 3 parking spaces behind the last bike, pressed flat against a concrete pillar, wearing a yellow summer dress that was wildly wrong for the weather. Her feet were bare on the oil-stained floor. She was 7, maybe 8, and she was looking at him with eyes that had already done the math and concluded that the enormous, bearded, leather-clad stranger was the better option compared to whatever she was hiding from. That alone told him everything he needed to know about what she was hiding from. He didn't move toward her. He stayed exactly where he was, crouched slightly so he wasn't towering over her, and he kept his voice at the particular frequency he used for things he needed to say only once. "You're safe," he said. "Nobody's going to touch you." Behind him, without a word being exchanged, he heard the other 5 men shift position. A decade of riding together in situations that occasionally went sideways had produced something between protocol and instinct. Rook moved left toward the stairwell door. Dutch drifted toward the vehicle ramp. Callum and the 2 older members, Wade and Priest, spread out along the row of parked cars with the casual, unhurried efficiency of men who knew how to fill a space without appearing to. The girl watched all of it happen. Something in her face changed. Not relief. Not yet. But a recalibration. Like she was revising an assessment she'd already made and arriving at a different answer. She came out from behind the pillar. She crossed the 3 parking spaces between them, and she grabbed the back of his vest with both hands, and she pressed her face between his shoulder blades, and she started to shake. Graves stood very still and let her. 40 seconds later, a man appeared at the top of the vehicle ramp. He was somewhere in his 40s, medium height, wearing a dark wool coat that fit him too well to be off the rack. His shoes were expensive. His hands were in his pockets. He came down the slope with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to walking into rooms and having the room adjust to him, and he was already constructing a smile before he'd fully assessed what he was walking toward. The smile made it maybe 3 seconds before it started to degrade. He stopped when he saw how the bikers were arranged. "Hey," he said. His voice was calibrated, friendly, reasonable, just the right pitch of mildly concerned. "Hey, there she is. Sophie, come on, sweetheart. I've been looking everywhere for you." The girl's hands tightened on the back of Graves's vest so hard he could feel individual knuckles. She said nothing. Graves turned around slowly, which meant the girl had to move with him, and he let his eyes settle on the man in the wool coat with the expression he usually reserved for IEDs that had already been identified and hadn't gone off yet. "What's her name?" he said. The man's smile recalibrated. "Sophie, she's my daughter. She tends to wander, and I've been—" "What's her name?" Graves said again. Not louder, not differently inflected. Just again. A pause that lasted about half a beat too long. "Sophie." Less certain this time. Graves looked down at the top of the girl's head. She had turned to look at the man over Graves's arm, and the trembling had intensified. He kept his voice even. "What's your name?" he asked her. "Lila," she said. "Lila June Avery." The name landed in the garage like a key turning in a lock. Graves looked back at the man. The man said nothing for a moment. Then, "She's confused. She does this sometimes. She gets—" "And your name?" Graves said. "Daniel. Daniel Avery. She uses her mother's maiden name sometimes when she's—" "My daddy's name was Daniel," Lila said. Her voice was very small and very precise. He died saving people from a highway fire when I was 4. Mama has pictures." The garage was silent enough that Graves could hear the sleet hitting the roof panels 2 floors above. The man in the wool coat was no longer smiling. Graves absorbed this. The name the man had chosen, Daniel, was either the most arrogant coincidence he had encountered in 58 years of living, or it was something else. Something deliberate. Someone had done research. Someone had known this girl's father's name and had chosen it as an alias, banking on the idea that a confused, frightened child might doubt her own memory before she doubted an adult presenting her dead father's name with confidence. The calculation of it turned something cold in his stomach. "How did you get here?" Graves asked the man. Conversational. The question could mean a dozen things. "I drove. I told you. I've been—" "Where's your car?" A fractional hesitation. "Street level." "Rook," Graves said, without looking away from the man. Rook's boots moved on the concrete. 30 seconds. Then, 2 vehicles on the ramp above. Black SUVs, 2 in each, that I can see. The man in the wool coat's expression changed for the 3rd time. The friendliness was gone. The concern was gone. What replaced it was something flatter and more honest, and in some ways that was worse, because flat honesty on a face like that meant the performance had ended. He was no longer managing the situation. He was assessing it. Lila felt the shift. She pressed closer to Graves and he moved his arm so it was across her back without thinking about it, the way you move to shield something that matters before you've consciously decided it matters. "She was at the Millard Street playground," Lila said, her voice muffled against his side. "I was at the swings. He came and said Mama sent him. He said Mama was hurt, and she needed me to come right now." A beat. "I know Mama's number. I tried to say I wanted to call, but he already had my hand." Graves kept his eyes on the man. "You took her hand," he said. Flat. A statement. "This is a misunderstanding. You told a 7-year-old her mother was hurt. I think—" "You told a 7-year-old her mother was hurt," Graves said again, "and you put your hand on her, and you brought her here, and you are not her father." The man reached into his coat pocket. Dutch moved before anyone spoke, coming in at the angle that cut off both the reach and the exit, and the man stopped with his hand still inside the coat and looked at the distance between himself and the big paramedic, and did the kind of arithmetic that sensible people did when they recognized they were outnumbered by men who were not afraid of them. He took his hand out of his pocket. It was holding a phone. Disposable. Cheap plastic shell. No case. "I want to call—" "I know what you want," Graves said. And the sleet kept falling on the roof above, and the 2 black SUVs sat at the top of the ramp, and Lila June Avery pressed her face into the leather of Graves's vest and tried very hard to be invisible, and Graves stood in the red emergency light of an underground garage in a town he'd never meant to stop in, on a night he hadn't planned, and felt the shape of the situation settle around him like weight. He had spent most of his adult life trying not to be the kind of man who did things he couldn't take back. He had failed at that project more than once. But standing here, with a barefoot 7-year-old in a summer dress attached to his back, with the ghost of his daughter Maya so close he could almost hear her voice, with a man in expensive shoes who had said a dead father's name to a grieving child like it was a key to a door, Graves understood that some nights the decision had already been made before you arrived, that some crossroads you didn't choose. They chose you. He turned slightly to look at Lila. She looked back at him, cheeks still wet, still shaking, but watching him with those recalibrated eyes that had decided in some fundamental way that children were sometimes better at than adults, that this particular dangerous man was not a danger to her. "Are you scared?" he asked. She thought about it seriously. "Yes," she said, "but not of you." Something tore open in his chest. He looked back at the man with the disposable phone, and he heard the engines of the SUVs above turning over, idling, waiting for some signal, and he heard Rook say quietly from the stairwell that there were footsteps on the stairs, more than 2 sets, coming down, and he heard Dutch say the ramp was blocked, and he heard the sleet, and he heard his own heartbeat, even and slow the way it always went when things got bad enough that calm became the only available option. "Callum," he said. "Yeah." "Kill the main lights." The garage dropped into darkness, punctured only by the blood-red pulse of emergency lamps. And in that new dark, the concrete pillars threw long shadows across the floor, and the boots of men who had learned patience in worse places than this settled into their positions. And the man in the wool coat stood very still in the center of it all, and the SUVs above began to move. And Lila June Avery, barefoot and shaking in a yellow summer dress, reached up in the dark and found Graves's hand with both of hers. He did not pull away. And in that moment, in the red-washed dark, with engines rumbling down the ramp above, and the weight of something enormous beginning to descend, A question arrived in the back of Gideon Mercer's mind that he hadn't thought to ask yet, hadn't had time to ask, but which was suddenly, in the way that the most important questions always were, the only thing that mattered. Why Harrow Creek? Of all the places to bring a child you'd taken from a playground in broad daylight. Why an underground garage in a mid-sized town that nobody important had ever heard of? Why not a vehicle, a highway, a border crossing? Why here? Why this building? Why the second level specifically, where the only exits were now occupied by men who had not been part of anyone's plan? Unless the garage wasn't the destination. Unless someone had been waiting here already. Unless the vehicles at the top of the ramp weren't backup. They were the transfer point, and whatever was supposed to happen in this garage tonight had not yet happened. Because a barefoot girl in a summer dress had hidden behind a concrete pillar and grabbed the back of a leather vest that did not belong to the man who was supposed to arrive. The first SUV's headlights swept down the ramp and flooded the lower level in white light, and in that blinding second, Graves saw the man with the disposable phone raise it to his ear, and he saw the expression on the man's face, and it was not the expression of someone frightened. It was the expression of someone reporting a complication. The first SUV came down the ramp at 15 miles an hour with its high beams on full, and the light hit the garage floor like a detonation. Graves didn't move. He stood exactly where he was, Lila's hands locked around his left, and he let the light wash over him the way he had learned to let a lot of things wash over him. Artillery sound, bad news, grief, by simply not flinching and waiting to see what came after. What came after was a black Chevrolet Suburban with tinted glass and a front license plate that had been removed. It stopped 20 feet from where he stood. The second SUV followed 8 seconds behind and stopped at an angle that blocked the ramp exit with the particular precision of people who had done this before and understood vehicle positioning in enclosed spaces. The man with the disposable phone lowered it slowly. He wasn't looking at Graves anymore. He was looking past him, into the darkness behind the row of parked cars, doing arithmetic of his own. Now, in arriving at answers he didn't appear to like. The SUV doors opened. 4 men. Graves counted without appearing to. 2 from the first vehicle, 2 from the second, all dressed in the kind of dark, generic clothing that was specifically chosen to be forgettable. They weren't carrying visible weapons, but the way they moved, weight forward, hands loose, spacing out without being told, communicated a professional familiarity with situations where weapons became relevant. Graves felt Lila pull slightly behind him. He felt the shift in the darkness where his men were. Not movement exactly. Potential movement. The coiled spring stillness of people who had made the internal decision to act and were now simply waiting for the precise moment. The man from the ramp, the one who had called himself Daniel, walked toward the first SUV. A taller man had climbed out of the passenger side, and they exchanged words. Graves couldn't hear at this distance, low and quick. The taller man glanced over at Graves with the flat, assessing look of someone evaluating an obstacle rather than a person. Then he walked toward Graves. He was perhaps 6'2", lean without being slight, with a face that had the specific expressionlessness of someone who had learned to remove himself from whatever he was doing as a professional habit. He wore no coat despite the cold that was leaking down the ramp from outside. His hands stayed at his sides. He stopped 10 feet away and looked at Graves for a long moment. "You're not police," he said. A statement. "No," Graves agreed. "Motorcycle club." "We were passing through." The man's eyes moved to Lila, then back to Graves. "Then pass through." "We will," Graves said. "She comes with us." The silence that followed had weight to it. The kind that accumulated in small spaces when people who understood violence were on opposite sides of a decision. "That's not possible," the man said. "I'm looking at her," Graves said. "Seems possible." Something moved through the man's expression. Not anger, not quite. Something more mechanical than anger. A recalculation. He looked at the garage around him, at the specific positions of the shadows, and Graves watched him understand what he was looking at. 6 men who had positioned themselves without being told, without noise, with the spatial intelligence of people who had done room clearing in buildings that were not safe. "You have no idea what you're involved in," the man said. "Getting clear every minute," Graves said. "Walk away." The man's voice didn't rise. "Take your people, get on your bikes, ride south. No one follows you. No one knows your names. This is the last time I'll make this offer." Probably, Graves said. Another silence. She's not yours. She's not yours either, Graves said. And she's not his. He didn't look at the man from the ramp. He didn't need to. And she is not going with any of you tonight. The taller man studied him for 3 more seconds. Then he turned and walked back toward the SUV and said something to the men standing there, and the atmosphere in the garage changed the way it changed before weather arrived. A pressure shift, a drop in temperature, a sense of the air rearranging itself in preparation for something. Rook appeared at Graves's left shoulder from the darkness between 2 parked sedans. He was 39 years old and built like something that had been constructed rather than born, and his voice when he spoke was barely above a murmur. The stairwell door, someone's in it, has been since before they drove in. Graves processed this. How many in the stairwell? I heard 2, could be more. So the SUVs weren't just the transfer point, they were the distraction. The stairwell team was the actual play. Come in from below while attention was on the vehicles. Standard enough if you knew what you were dealing with. The problem was that Rook had grown up in the particular school of attention that the Marine Corps ran in a mountainous country where inattention had a very immediate and permanent cost, and he noticed things that other people missed the way other people breathed. Wade, Graves said, without raising his voice. From somewhere in the darkness behind a concrete pillar, a low sound of acknowledgement. Stairwell door. Hold it. Boots shifted on concrete. Graves looked down at Lila. She was looking up at him. The shaking had not stopped, but it had changed in quality. Less shock now, more the sustained trembling of a body that had been running on adrenaline past its capacity. Her feet on the cold concrete floor must have been painful. He hadn't thought about her feet. Can you walk? He asked. She nodded. I need you to stay right next to me. Can you do that? Yes. If I say down, you go flat, right there on the floor, whatever surface. Don't think about it, just down. She nodded again, processing this with the focused seriousness that children sometimes displayed when adults spoke to them like the situation was real and they were capable of handling it. What's your mom's name? Graves asked. Marin. Where does she work? She has a diner, Daniel's Roadhouse, on Culver Street. A fractional pause. It was my dad's name. She named it after him. Does she know where you are? Lila's face answered that before her voice did. No. Behind him, Graves heard the taller man's voice carrying across the garage in a tone that had shifted from negotiation to instruction, talking to his people, not to Graves anymore. And he heard the particular sound of men redistributing weight and grip, which was a sound he had learned to identify the same way he had learned to identify the sound of a pin being pulled. Dutch, he said. From his right, 10 feet away. Yeah. We need communication out of here. A pause. Signals blocked below ground. Of course it was. That was also deliberate. Someone had done reconnaissance on this location, or done enough similar operations to know that underground parking structures with concrete walls and no repeaters killed cell signals efficiently. The only working phone in this garage was the disposable the man from the ramp was holding, the man who had called himself Daniel, who had known a dead father's name, who had looked at a 7-year-old on a playground and constructed a lie calibrated to that specific child's specific grief. Graves made himself stop thinking about that before the anger became something he couldn't control, because right now he needed control more than he needed the anger to mean something. Rook, he said, the SUVs, keys. Rook didn't respond verbally. A few seconds later, Graves heard rapid movement on the far side of the garage, a door being tried, the specific tonal shift of someone reaching into a vehicle interior, and then a sound he recognized, a keyless fob being pocketed. The taller man's voice sharpened. That's a mistake, but he called across the garage. Probably, Graves said for the second time. Everything moved then. The stairwell door burst open and 2 men came through it fast, moving low, and the sound that filled the garage was boots on concrete and the clatter of a metal door hitting a wall, and Dutch's voice saying one word, Wade. And then Wade, 54 years old, former Army medic, with the barrel chest and the bad shoulder that had ended his service, and the absolute absence of hesitation that 20 years of patching up people on the worst days of their lives had produced in him, stepped into the path of the first man and took him off his feet with a lateral motion that was not graceful and was not cinematic and was brutally effective. The second man stopped. He looked at Wade. He looked at the darkness where the other saints were positioned. He looked back at his colleague on the floor. He took a step backward toward the stairwell. "Don't," Rook said, from somewhere behind him. The stairwell door was already closed. Rook was leaning against it. The second man raised his hands slowly. Callum came out from behind a concrete pillar with zip ties that he produced from an inside vest pocket with the brisk efficiency of a man who had learned to keep them there after a situation 3 years ago in a bar parking lot in Tucson that none of them talked about in specifics, but that everyone in the club was aware of in outline. He got the first man's hand secured before the man had fully processed being on the floor. The taller man by the SUVs watched all of this without visible reaction. Then he looked at Graves. "You understand you've just made this significantly worse." "For who?" Graves said. "For the child." The word hit like it was designed to, like someone had selected it from a toolbox of precisely calibrated language and placed it there because they knew the specific frequency it would operate on. Graves looked at the man for a long moment. "Walk away from that vehicle," he said. "Sit down on the floor, all 4 of you." "You can't hold us here." "I'm not planning to hold you here," Graves said. "I'm planning to keep holding her until someone comes who isn't you, and then this ends." "No police," the taller man said. Still flat. Still without elevation. "You call police, she disappears before they arrive. We have people on every exit of this building. We have the street covered from 3 positions. You call police, the building goes into a situation you cannot control, and a lot of things happen that are bad for everyone in this structure." He paused, "including a barefoot little girl who should be home in bed." Lila's hand tightened on Graves's. He felt that tightening like a cable pulling taut. And then, from his left, in a voice pitched so only Graves could hear it, Dutch said, "He might not be wrong." Graves turned his head slightly. Dutch was standing 4 feet away, leaning against a concrete pillar, and his face in the red emergency light had the expression he wore when he was about to say something that someone wasn't going to want to hear. He was a big man, Dutch, 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, with a paramedic's hands that were always slightly restless, always taking small unconscious readings of whatever body was nearest, looking for vital signs, looking for what wasn't right. He had seen more people die than most doctors. It had left him with a kind of radical, unromantic clarity about situations, which was useful and sometimes maddening. "He's talking about a coordinated response," Dutch said. "Somebody planned this. Multiple vehicles, stairwell team, signal blocking, street coverage. This isn't 3 guys in a parking lot. If we light up the police frequency, someone on their end hears it." "You think they have a scanner?" Graves said. "I think a person who can plan this has a scanner." Graves looked at the taller man who was waiting with the patience of someone who understood that time was working in his favor. The man from the ramp, Daniel, the not Daniel, was standing slightly apart, watching Graves now with an expression that had changed again. Something had crept into it. Not fear exactly. Something more interior than fear. He looked, Graves thought, like a man who was beginning to understand that he was the least important person in this building, and that the people who had sent him here shared that assessment. A disposable man, brought in to do the one task that required a face, a voice, a plausible story about a dead father, and now standing in a garage that hadn't gone the way it was supposed to, holding a phone he'd already used, surrounded by men who were not going to let him leave. Graves looked at him directly for the first time since the lights had gone red. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. The man looked back at him. "Shut up," he said. To himself, maybe, to Graves. The words came out with the quality of something a person said when they were trying to close a door inside themselves that kept swinging open. "How many kids?" Graves said. "I said shut up." "How many before her?" "I'm warning you." "You're not warning anyone," Graves said quietly. "You're standing in a garage you can't leave with a phone that's evidence and a story that 2 minutes with the girl's mother would have ended before it started. You're not a professional. You're somebody they call when they need a face." He paused. "Whose face did they use before yours?" The man looked away. Lila had gone very still beside Graves. He looked down at her and she was watching the man from the ramp with an expression he didn't like. The expression of a child who was listening too carefully, storing too much, being required to understand things that were going to cost her for years. "Look at me," he said to her softly. She looked at him. "Don't look at him." She nodded and turned her face away and pressed it against Graves's arm. The taller man by the SUV took a step forward. Just one. Testing something. "We've been patient," he said. "We understand you don't want to be involved. We understand this was not your intention tonight. So let me offer you a different arrangement." He reached into his coat, slowly, deliberately, visible, and removed a folded envelope and held it out. "Walk away. Take your people. Leave the child. Drive north and don't come back to this part of the state." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Graves looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then he looked at the taller man. "Priest," he said. From the darkness between two vehicles, a shape moved. The one they called Priest was the oldest of the saints at 61, a wiry, gray-bearded former helicopter crew chief who had served 3 tours and come home with both eardrums partially damaged and a calm so profound it read as something beyond ordinary stoicism. He didn't speak often. When he did, it was usually one sentence, and it was usually enough. He stepped up beside Graves and looked at the taller man and looked at the envelope and then looked back at Graves. "Burning weather," he said. It was a phrase they used. It meant the kind of night that gets worse before it gets better, and everybody knows it, and you move anyway. Graves nodded. Then he looked at the taller man. "We're not leaving her," he said. "That's not an outcome that exists for us tonight. You can use that information however you want." The taller man lowered the envelope. He looked at Graves with an expression that had finally changed. Not to anger, not to anything crude. Something more refined and in some ways more unsettling. The expression of a man who was updating a plan, who was moving pieces on a board in his head, who was noting that one pathway had been blocked and identifying the next available one. He looked at Lila. She had turned her face back. She was looking at him. She didn't look away. Something passed through the taller man's face that was almost human. Almost something that could have been shame, or its ghost, or the memory of what shame had felt like before it was engineered out. He looked back at Graves. "Then you stay here," he said. "All of you. Until we reach an arrangement. And the longer this takes, the harder it gets on everyone in this building." He stepped back to the SUV and got in. The doors closed. The other 3 men didn't get back in their vehicles. They stood outside them, at a distance from the saints that was negotiated in the unspoken language of people who understood space and proximity and waited. The man from the ramp sat down on the concrete floor. Not because anyone told him to, because his legs appeared to have run out of the particular energy that purpose provides. And without purpose, he had nothing to keep him upright. Graves looked around the garage, Rook against the stairwell, Dutch near the ramp, Callum with the 2 secured men in the far corner, sitting on the floor with their hands behind them, quiet. Wade standing in the center with his bad shoulder rolled slightly forward, which was what it did when he was tired. Priest put a hand briefly on Graves's arm. A question. Graves turned away from the SUVs. He walked to the far side of the garage, out of earshot of the taller man's vehicles, and the ones who could move came with him. Rook, Dutch, Priest, leaving Callum and Wade on position. Lila came with Graves. He hadn't told her to. She simply did. They stood in a rough cluster between a support column and a blue Honda Civic that belonged to whoever actually worked in this building, and Dutch said, before anyone else could, "We can't hold this." "No," Graves agreed. "They have the street. They have people outside." Dutch's jaw worked. "They also have time. We don't know how long before they decide patience isn't working." "And we don't know who else is coming," Rook said. "Or how many," Priest said. The silence that followed was not comfortable. The Saints were not a club that performed unity. They disagreed. They said so. They had a functional system for working through disagreement that involved people saying what they actually thought without softening it, because in situations where softening cost you information, you did not soften. Dutch said, "We could negotiate, limited exchange, we trade the 2 in zip ties for a way out." "No," Graves said. "Graves, they walk. The men outside know we're willing to trade. The next trade they offer involves her." Dutch exhaled through his nose. "Then we need communication out of here. Somebody needs to get a phone signal." "Street level," Rook said. "Ramp goes up. If someone gets to the top of the ramp and gets a bar..." "They have the street covered," Priest said. "He said 3 positions." "He said," Rook's voice was careful, "we haven't confirmed that." "You want to test it," Dutch said, flat, not quite an accusation. I want communication more than I want to stand here debating it. Graves looked at each of them in turn. These were the faces he had ridden 1,000 miles beside, had sat in hospital waiting rooms beside, had attended funerals beside. He knew the specific weight of every silence each of them carried. He knew which wounds were still open and which had closed badly over something that still needed to drain. He had no romantic illusions about them. They were damaged men with complicated histories and imperfect judgment, and the kind of loyalty that was less like love and more like the choice you made every morning to show up regardless. It was the only kind of loyalty he trusted. "Rook," he said, "stairwell goes up to the lobby. Lobby has windows on the street." "Right. You'd be moving past their ground team. I've moved past worse. If they have someone inside, then I find out," Rook said, "and I adapt." Graves looked at him. Rook met it without expression. They were the two oldest members in terms of operational experience, and there was a kind of communication between them that existed below language. A shared vocabulary of what was acceptable risk versus what was theater, built over 12 years of situations that had each added a layer. "2 minutes," Graves said. "If you're not back in 2 minutes, or we don't hear from you, then something happened and you adjust." Rook said it without effect. Not bravado, just the practical acknowledgement of reality that people arrived at when they stopped being afraid of the worst case and started treating it as a planning variable. He moved toward the stairwell door. Graves watched him go. Dutch said quietly, "He shouldn't go alone." "He's harder to miss if he's not alone." Dutch didn't argue with that. Lila said from somewhere near Graves's elbow, "Is he going to get hurt?" Graves looked down at her. The question was asked with the same focused precision she brought to everything. Not theatrical, not manipulative, just honest. She wanted to know. She was asking because she understood that people were putting themselves in danger on her behalf, and she was old enough to feel the weight of that. He thought about lying to her, the automatic protective reflex toward children and truth. He decided against it. "I don't know," he said. "He's very good at what he does. That helps." She accepted this, nodded once. "My daddy was good at what he did," she said. "He was a first responder, volunteer. He went to a highway accident on his own time because someone called and said it was bad. It was bad." She paused. "Mama says that's just who he was. She says it like it's a good thing and also like it breaks her heart every single time." Graves didn't say anything. What was there to say? He thought of Maya, who had been nervous about a job interview and had called him twice the night before. He thought of the drunk driver, who had walked away from the scene. He thought of the 11 days he hadn't spoken and the particular quality of the silence in his house during those 11 days, which was different from any other silence he had known because it had the shape of a person in it. He thought about how grief worked, how it didn't get smaller, how you just got larger around it, if you were careful, and learned to carry it differently. "Your dad sounds like he was a good man," he said. "He was," Lila said, simply, without performance. The 2 minutes passed. Rook didn't come back. Dutch and Graves looked at each other. Priest said, 3 minutes. 4. Callum's voice came across the garage in a low, controlled pitch. Movement, left side of the ramp. Everyone turned. A figure was moving down the vehicle ramp from street level, walking at a pace that was not rushed, not running, not the aggressive, forward-weight approach of someone arriving for a confrontation. Walking the way someone walked when they had already won the confrontation and were arriving to administer the outcome. It wasn't Rook. It was a man Graves had never seen before. Older than the taller man by the SUVs, heavier, wearing a suit that would have been appropriate for a business dinner on a Wednesday evening in a city where business dinners happened and people dressed for them. His hair was white and precisely cut. He wore no coat. His hands were folded in front of him as he walked, which was a specific body language choice. Visible hands, no threat signal, also no pockets, also no concealment, also the projection of absolute confidence that came from knowing that everyone who was going to make the threats on your behalf was already in position. He stopped at the bottom of the ramp. He looked at Graves the way a person looked at a delay. "Mr. Mercer," he said. Graves felt the use of his name like a cold finger on the back of his neck. He had not given his name to anyone in this building. "You know who I am," Graves said. A statement. "I know who all of you are," the man said. Conversational, almost pleasant. Gideon Mercer, Ashen Saints, Former combat engineer, 2 tours. A man with very specific reasons for being sensitive to situations involving children. He let that land. I understand your hesitation. I understand your reaction. Given your history, it's almost predictable. Almost predictable. He was reciting from a file. Someone had run them in the time since the SUVs arrived, or before, which meant the signal block wasn't total, which meant they had their own communication in here that Graves's team didn't have access to, which meant, "Where's my man?" Graves said. The white-haired man's expression adjusted slightly. Your associate is being held in the lobby. He's unharmed. He'll remain that way as long as this conversation stays productive. Dutch made a sound. Graves put one hand out to his side, not touching Dutch, just present, just steady, and Dutch stopped. Lila had gone very, very still. The white-haired man looked at her for a moment, then back at Graves. This doesn't have to be complicated, he said. I've dealt with complications tonight that I didn't anticipate. I find them inconvenient. I dislike inconvenience. What I like is resolution. He unclasped his hands. Let them hang at his sides. The girl has nothing to do with you. Whatever you feel about that, whatever this situation is pressing against in your personal history, it doesn't change what she is, or what tonight is, or how this ends. And how does it end? Graves said. She comes with us, the man said. Your man in the lobby is released. Your people leave this building and this city and this situation, and everyone is intact. That is the cleanest version. The cleanest version, Graves repeated. Yes. And what do the other versions look like? The man looked at him with the patience of someone who had been in rooms where this specific conversation had happened before and already knew how it resolved. They look like this becoming a police matter, he said, and a police matter becoming a public matter, and a public matter involving a motorcycle club that has had 3 of its members arrested in the past 7 years, even without conviction, becoming a very long, very exhausting examination of your organization, your finances, your histories, the histories of people you care about. His eyes moved briefly to Lila again. The child's mother, her background. Whether a woman running a struggling diner alone is really the most stable environment for a traumatized girl who… Stop! Graves said it quietly. The man stopped. The garage held itself very still. Graves was aware of the specific quality of the silence among his own people, not the explosive silence of people about to act. Something darker. The silence of people absorbing what had just been said and what it implied, and finding in it something that required response at a level below words. They had come after the mother. They had prepared the threat about the mother, which meant they had prepared for this, which meant someone had done the research before the child was even taken. Profile the family, identify the pressure points, map the leverage. It wasn't just about tonight and one parking garage in one mid-sized city. This was infrastructure. This was practiced. How many cities? Graves had asked the man from the ramp. How many kids? The man from the ramp had looked away. He had the answer. He simply couldn't live with saying it out loud. Graves looked at the white-haired man and felt the anger reach a particular depth that had no heat in it anymore, just cold and weight, and the specific quality of a decision that had stopped being a decision and was now simply the only available fact. You threatened her mother, Graves said. I outlined a potential outcome, the man said. You threatened her mother in front of her. The man glanced at Lila. Something crossed his face that might, in another life, have been reconsideration. That was not, she's 7 years old, Graves said, and you stood in front of her and you used her mother as a threat. And you said her name. Marin. You said Marin. His voice hadn't risen. It was at the same pitch and volume as everything else he'd said tonight. You want me to believe this ends cleanly. You want me to believe that the people who did the research, who know her mother's name, who had the lobby covered before I knew we needed the lobby. You want me to believe those people let this go. You want me to believe we get on our bikes and we ride and nobody follows up. The man held his gaze, didn't answer, which was its own answer. Callum, Graves said. Yeah. Call Voss. Dutch turned. Graves, call Voss. The signal's… Callum has a SAT-enabled device, Graves said. He always has a SAT-enabled device. It's in his left inside pocket, because Tucson. He looked at Callum across the garage. Call Mara Voss, tell her what we have and where we are. Callum already had his hand inside his vest. The white-haired man's expression changed. Finally. The patients cracked slightly at the edges. Not much, not catastrophically, but enough. Just enough to show what was underneath it. Not panic, but the recognition that a variable had been introduced that his model hadn't included. He reached into his jacket. Not a weapon. Another phone. This one not disposable. He raised it to his ear, and in the moment before he spoke into it, in the last second of what had been an almost negotiation in an underground garage in a town called Harrow Creek, Lila June Avery did something that none of them expected. She let go of Graves's hand. She stepped forward, 3 steps, out from behind him, into the open space between the saints and the man in the suit, and she stood there in her yellow dress with her bare feet on the freezing concrete floor, and she looked at the white-haired man and she said, in a voice that was absolutely steady, "My mama's name is Marin Louise Avery, and she wakes up at 5 in the morning to make coffee before she opens the diner, and she has a scar on her left hand from a kitchen accident when I was 2, and she always smells like cinnamon and dish soap. She's my mama, and you don't get to say her name." The white-haired man looked at her. The garage was completely, absolutely silent, and then the man lowered his phone without speaking into it, and he looked at Graves over the girl's head, and the thing in his expression was not what Graves had expected to find there. Not calculation, not reassessment, not threat, but something that appeared to have broken through the professional surface of the man from somewhere much deeper below it. Something old and damaged and perhaps even ashamed, and it lasted for only a fraction of a second before the surface closed over it again. But Graves had seen it, and the knowledge of it lodged in him like a splinter, because it meant something about this man that changed what was possible and also made it more dangerous, because there was nothing in the world more unpredictable than a person in this particular kind of work who had not yet finished killing whatever was left of their conscience. Lila stepped back and found Graves's hand again. He took it, and somewhere above them, in the lobby of 14 Meridian Street, a single gunshot rang out. The gunshot came down through the concrete ceiling like a fist. One shot, clean, no follow-up, which was almost worse than multiple shots because multiple shots meant a firefight, and a firefight had variable outcomes. But one shot, single and final, meant someone had made a decision and carried it through to its conclusion, and the only question was who had made it and on whose behalf. Graves was moving before the echo died. He pulled Lila behind the nearest concrete pillar, a structural column wide enough to shield her completely, and he pressed her back against it and crouched to her eye level and held her face in both hands and looked at her directly. "Stay here," he said. "Back flat against this column. Do not move for any reason." Her eyes were wide, but her breathing was controlled. 7 years old and controlling her breathing in a parking garage after a gunshot. He didn't have time to think about what that meant for her, what it was going to cost her later, in the dark, in the years ahead. "Do you understand me?" "Yes," she said. He stood. Dutch was already at the stairwell door, hand flat against it, listening. Wade had moved to the ramp-side pillar with a view of both the SUVs and the white-haired man, who had not moved from his position at the bottom of the vehicle ramp. The man in the suit still had his phone in his hand, lowered now, and his face had rearranged itself back into the controlled blankness of professional composure. But there was something around the edges of it, a particular tension in the jaw, a stillness that was too deliberate, that told Graves the gunshot had not been in the white-haired man's plan either. Or if it was in the plan, it had happened earlier than intended. Both possibilities were bad. "Callum," Graves said. Graves. "Voss is on the line," Callum said from across the garage, phone pressed to his ear, voice just above a murmur. "She's 22 minutes out. She says don't engage, don't negotiate, hold position." 22 minutes. Graves looked at the stairwell door. Rook was in the lobby. "Dutch," he said. Dutch turned from the stairwell door. Their eyes met. 22 minutes was a long time. 22 minutes when Rook was upstairs and a single shot had come down through the ceiling was a very long time. "I'm going up," Dutch said. He said it the way he said everything, not requesting permission, not performing bravado, stating a fact about what he was about to do. "They have the lobby," Graves said. "Rook is in the lobby." "I know." "One shot," Dutch said. "Then nothing. That could mean anything." "It means we don't know," Graves said. "And right now not knowing is the situation." "Then I go and find out. If they grab you, then you have 2 people to get out of here instead of 1, and that's harder, and you're better at harder than I am anyway." Dutch said it without irony. He meant it as a structural assessment. "I'm the medic. If he's hurt, you need me up there more than you need me down here." Graves held his position for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was a long time when you were counting them in a place like this. Then he stepped aside. Dutch pulled the stairwell door open and went through it, and the door swung shut behind him with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The white-haired man watched all of this without speaking. His 3 remaining men stood by the SUVs. Nobody was approaching. Nobody was retreating. The garage had settled into a strange, suspended equilibrium, the kind that preceded either resolution or catastrophe, and both were waiting on the same trigger. Graves walked to where the man from the ramp was still sitting on the floor. The man, not Daniel, disposable Daniel, whoever he actually was, had his arms wrapped around his knees and was looking at the floor between his shoes with the focused intentness of someone who had decided the floor was safer to look at than anything else in the building. His disposable phone was on the concrete beside him. He hadn't reached for it since Callum had gotten the satellite line open. Graves crouched in front of him. The man didn't look up. "Hey," Graves said. "Nothing. I need you to look at me." The man looked up. His eyes were bloodshot. Not from crying, from the particular vascular stress of sustained fear over a prolonged period, the kind that left small broken vessels in the whites, and gave a person the look of someone who hadn't slept in days. He was maybe 45. There were deep lines around his mouth that hadn't come from smiling. "What's your name?" Graves said. A pause. "Cole," the man said. "Cole what?" "Does it matter?" "Everything matters right now," Graves said. Cole looked at him. He had the expression of someone running a calculation about how much truth was survivable. "Garrison," he said finally. "Cole Garrison." "How long have you been doing this, Cole?" The man looked away again. "Cole." 2 years, he said, barely above a whisper. "Almost 2 years." The number landed in the concrete space between them and sat there. "How many children?" Graves said. Cole Garrison pressed his lips together. "Cole, I don't know all of them." The words came out with the particular shape of something that had been held under pressure for a long time and had finally found a fracture to move through. "They don't tell you the others. They keep you in sections. You do your part. You don't know what comes before or after. That's how it works. That's how they make sure nobody knows enough to—" He stopped, swallowed. "I did the approach. I was the face. I had a background that was clean and a face that was—" Another stop. "They said it would be 2 times. Pay a debt and walk. The first time I told myself it was isolated. The second time I told myself the same thing. And then there was a 3rd time and a 4th. And by then—" He stopped again. Graves waited. "By then they owned the knowing," Cole said. "Once you know what you know and you've done what you've done, they don't need to threaten you anymore. You threaten yourself, every single day." The garage was very quiet. Priest was 3 feet away, leaning against the blue Honda Civic, arms crossed, listening. His face was unreadable in the red light. He had the quality of someone witnessing a confession not to judge it, but to understand its architecture, to map where the crack had started and how far it had run before it reached here. "The man upstairs," Graves said to Cole. "The one in the suit. Who is he?" Cole looked toward the white-haired man across the garage. The distance between them was perhaps 40 feet, but the way Cole looked at it was the way you looked at something that had no bottom. "Harlan Vess," he said. The name meant nothing to Graves, but the way Cole said it, with the particular weight of someone saying a name they had never said aloud before, that they had only carried internally, told him the name meant something. "What does Harlan Vess do?" Graves said. "Officially?" Cole's mouth made a shape that wasn't quite a smile. "He's a senior investigator with the State Child Services Oversight Commission." The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. Graves felt it move through him. A senior investigator with child services. He stood up slowly and looked across the garage at the white-haired man in the well-cut suit, and he looked at him the way you looked at something after the context changed, when the same image meant a different thing, when the shape was the same, but the nature of it had inverted completely. Harlan Vess looked back at him with the patience of someone who knew the moment of understanding had arrived and was waiting for it to complete its passage through the person experiencing it. He's supposed to find them, Graves said. Not to Cole, to himself. He's supposed to find the missing ones, Cole said from the floor. Has access to every case file in the state, every family profile, every at-risk designation, every child in a system that isn't watching carefully enough. He paused. That's how they find the ones nobody will look too hard for. Graves was aware of his own breathing. He was aware of his hands and where they were, because in situations like this, your hands were important. What they did or didn't do, how you kept them from doing the thing that the anger at their deepest register was suggesting. I was aware of Lila behind the concrete pillar and the bare fact that she was 7 years old and that Harlan Vess had access to every family profile in the state and had looked through those files and had selected her specifically and had sent this man, this broken, hollowed-out man, sitting on a concrete floor with his arms around his knees, to put his hand on her at a playground and say a dead father's name like a key. He was aware of Maya. He made himself stop being aware of Maya because Maya was the thing that made his hands dangerous, and right now he needed his hands to be useful, not dangerous. How does he move them? Graves said to Cole. Flat, controlled, each word placed carefully. The vehicles get switched twice before they cross state lines. There's a coordination point. I don't know where, I was never in that part. And then they disappear into a logistics chain that I never had access to. Cole looked at his hands. I know there are people in 3 different law enforcement agencies who are... He stopped. Started again. Vess isn't the whole thing. He's one node. He handles acquisition in this region. There are others. Other regions, other nodes, other people like me who know one piece and not the rest. And the children, Graves said. Cole looked at the floor. Cole. I don't know, he said. I genuinely don't know, and I have made myself not try to know because knowing would... His voice cracked on something, sealed itself back shut. You think I'm a monster, he said. You should think that. I am. But I was also scared and stupid, and by the time I understood what I was inside of it so far that... You were inside of it, Graves said, and you stayed inside of it for 2 years. Cole had no answer to that. There wasn't one. Graves straightened and turned away from him and walked toward the center of the garage. Priest fell into step beside him without being asked. Wade moved over from the pillar. They stood in a loose triangle, and Graves said, quietly enough that Harlan Vess couldn't hear. He's Child Services Oversight. He has access to records, he has contacts in law enforcement, and he has at minimum 3 positions on the street outside. And Rook is upstairs, Wade said. And Rook is upstairs, Graves confirmed. Voss is 22 minutes, Priest said. 18 now, Callum said, from nearby, still holding the sat phone. 18 minutes to hold a garage with a man who has law enforcement contacts and the ability to make a phone call that makes us the primary problem in this situation, Graves said. He said it out loud because saying it out loud was how you map the shape of something clearly enough to move through it. If he calls his contacts before Voss gets here, then we're the biker club that kidnapped a man and assaulted 2 others in an underground parking structure, Wade said. And the girl is a confused child whose guardian arrived to collect her. That's the play he's been holding, Priest said. That's why he's still standing there. He's waiting to make that call. He's giving us the window to walk away because if we walk away, it's clean. If we don't walk away, he calls it in, and the responding officers are his, Graves said. Some of them, Wade said. Not all. Doesn't need all, Priest said. Needs first responders to secure the scene. Needs first responders to be looking at us, not at him. Graves turned and looked at Harlan Vess from across the garage. The man met his eyes. He hadn't moved. I was standing at the foot of the ramp with the composed stillness of a person who knew he held the initiative and was allowing time to work on his behalf. And there was in his bearing no visible anxiety, no visible doubt, only the practiced calm of institutional authority that had learned it could outlast almost anything by simply maintaining its surface. He had built a career on institutional authority. He had built a shadow career underneath it, and the shadow career had run for long enough that the shadow was more real than the surface. What do you need? Callum said. Graves looked at him. Callum was 34, the youngest, the one without military history, the one who had arrived at the club through a different kind of wreckage. He was holding the sat phone in his left hand and looking at Graves with the particular expression he wore in situations that required him to be more than he thought he was. A slightly forward tilt to the jaw, a deliberate stillness of the hands, as if he was physically holding himself in the version of himself that was adequate to the moment. "I need 10 more minutes of nothing changing," Graves said, "and I need Rook." "I can call back up to Voss," Callum said. "Tell her what we have on Vess, the name, the position, Cole's testimony." "Cole's testimony is from a man who is currently being held in a parking garage by a motorcycle club," Graves said. "A defense attorney turns that into nothing in 45 minutes. "So what—" "We need Rook," Graves said again. "Rook goes up, Rook sees the situation, Rook adapts. We know that. What we don't know is what the situation is." He paused. "And Dutch is up there now." As if in answer, the stairwell door opened. Everyone in the garage moved. It was simultaneous and instinctive. Bikers toward coverage positions, Vess's men straightening from their lean against the SUVs. Graves's hand coming up to the side where his arm had blocked Lila before he remembered Lila was behind the column, and this was someone coming through the door, and then he processed who it was. Dutch came through the stairwell door, and he was supporting Rook with one arm around his back and Rook's left arm across Dutch's shoulders. And Rook was walking, but walking with the particular deliberation of someone working through pain rather than impairment. Upright, present, mobile, but each step costing something. His right ear was bleeding. Not from a bullet. Graves processed this immediately. The angle was wrong. There was no entry wound. The blood was from the external ear and the skin along the jaw where something had struck him hard enough to split the surface without penetrating. Someone had hit him with an object. Something metal, by the stripe of the bruising already rising dark along his jawline in the red light. Rook met Graves's eyes as Dutch brought him across the floor. His expression was not pain. It was something more complex than pain. The tight, inward look of a man who had information that he was calculating how to deliver. "Sit," Dutch said, and Rook sat on the hood of the nearest car without argument, which told Graves more about the severity of the situation than any other single data point, because Rook argued with sitting down on principle. Dutch checked the ear with the practiced efficiency of someone who had assessed injuries in the back of ambulances at 3 in the morning with the vehicle moving. He pressed 2 fingers along the jaw, watched Rook's response, pressed 2 fingers behind the ear. "Concussive impact," Dutch said. "Skin split, ears not ruptured. You're going to have a headache for a week, but you're not going to fall over." "I know," Rook said. He was looking at Graves. "The lobby," Graves said. 2 men at the main entrance, 1 at the reception desk, 1 on the east stairwell, Rook said. His voice was slightly rougher than usual, but his diction was clean, another good sign. "They have the exits covered. The street. I gotta look through the lobby glass before they—" He paused and touched his jaw with 2 fingers. "Before they adjusted my posture. 3 vehicles, different positions. One of them is a police cruiser." The garage absorbed this. An unmarked presence was one thing. A police cruiser was the specific shape of institutional cover, the thing that turned a criminal operation into a sanctioned response, that turned 6 bikers holding a child into an active crime scene. "Whose cruiser?" Graves said. "No way to know," Rook said. "Could be genuine, could be Vess's contact. Either way, it reads the same from outside the building." Graves turned and looked at Harlan Vess and found the man already looking at him with the expression of someone who had been watching the arrival of this information and was now waiting for Graves to finish processing it. "The cruiser," Graves said across the distance. A statement. Vess said nothing. "You called it before you came down," Graves said. "Before the shot." Still nothing. "You came down here already knowing the exit was controlled," Graves said. "The shot was your people telling you it was done. You came down to deliver the information in person because you wanted to see my face when I understood." Something moved in Harlan Vess's expression. Not pride exactly. Something more hollow than pride. The simulacrum of satisfaction from a person who had removed so many internal obstacles to what he did that even the pleasure of it arrived secondhand. "You have 18 minutes, Vess said. That was always the window. Your contact," he meant Voss. He knew about Voss. "Is competent, but she's one investigator with standard response authority. The moment she arrives, she encounters an active scene with a law enforcement presence. She cannot override that presence without triggering a jurisdictional review that takes 6 to 8 hours. In 6 to 8 hours, many things change." He paused. "Walk away. I'll say it one final time. Walk away, and everything currently in this building goes with you, including your people." "Including the girl," Wade said, from 8 feet away. Vess looked at Wade. The girl is not negotiable. Funny, Wade said. That's exactly what we think. Wade was 54 years old, and the deliberate, unhurried way he said it, without heat, without performance, carried the specific weight of a man who had held people's lives in his hands in field conditions and had learned the difference between what was negotiable and what wasn't in the most fundamental possible terms. Vess looked back at him for a moment and then looked at Graves and made a small, conclusive gesture with the hand holding the phone. Then we wait, he said. He stepped back to the base of the ramp and stood there. Graves turned away. He walked to the concrete pillar where he'd left Lila and crouched down. She was sitting with her back against the column and her knees pulled up to her chest, bare feet flat on the concrete. She was cold. He could see it in the pallor of her skin and the slight blue tinge at her lips and the way she was holding herself compressed to retain whatever warmth she had. She had been cold since before she came into this garage. The yellow summer dress was wrong for December in ways that told a specific story about how quickly things had moved from playground to parking structure. He shrugged off his leather vest. Then he pulled off the flannel overshirt he wore beneath it, dark gray, heavy cotton, warm, and held it out to her. She looked at it, then at him. It's big, she said. Yeah, he said. It'll work. She took it and put it on. It came to her knees and the sleeves extended well past her hands, and she pulled them back so her fingers appeared at the cuffs and looked at him with an expression that was trying very hard to be okay and not quite making it. He put his vest back on over his thermal undershirt. Are we going to get out of here? She asked. He looked at her. The honest answer was, I don't know. The parental answer, the answer he would have given Maya at 7, was, yes, of course, don't worry. The honest parental answer, the one he had arrived at across 5 decades of learning, the children were more resilient than adults gave them credit for and more damaged by dishonesty than by hard truth, was something between those. Someone's coming to help us, he said. Someone good. We have to hold on until she gets here. A woman? Yeah. Lila processed this. Is she like you? No, Graves said. She's a detective. She's different. She works inside the system. Are you outside the system? He almost smiled. Almost. Something like that. The man in the suit is inside the system too, Lila said. He said he works for child services. Graves went very still. You heard that, he said. I was behind the column, she said, not inside it. He looked at her for a moment. Yeah, he said. He does. He works for child services. That means he's supposed to protect kids, she said. It means that's what he's supposed to do, Graves said. She thought about this with the focused, architectural seriousness that she applied to everything. Then she said, that's the scariest thing yet. He couldn't argue with that. He heard Callum say, from across the garage, Graves. He stood up. Callum had his hand over the sat phone's receiver, and he was looking at Graves with an expression that had gone several shades more complicated than the one he'd been wearing a minute ago. Voss has something, Callum said. She needs you. Graves crossed the garage, took the phone, pressed it to his ear. Voss, he said. Mara Voss's voice came through the satellite connection with the slight compression and digital edge of encrypted communication. Mercer, I'm 16 minutes out. I need you to listen to what I'm about to say, and I need you to stay very calm. I'm calm, he said. Harlan Vess, she said. I know who he is. A brief pause. I have a case file on Vess that I've been building for 7 months. I have not brought it forward because I do not have enough yet, and because 2 people who were looking at him before I started looking at him are no longer able to look at him. She said it plainly, without elaboration. The elaboration wasn't necessary. Graves looked at Harlan Vess standing at the foot of the vehicle ramp in his well-cut suit with his hands folded in front of him. How many? Graves said. The file is significant, Voss said. What I can tell you is that Lila Avery was specifically selected 18 days ago. He pulled her case file through his commission access. Her mother had contacted Child Services 8 months ago, voluntarily, trying to get financial assistance after the diner had a bad quarter. The intake created a record. Vess has access to every intake record in the state. The mother had reached out for help. The intake had created a record. The record had been the door. Graves put his hand on the nearest concrete pillar and felt the cold surface of it under his palm and breathed through what that meant. that Marin Avery had done the thing you were supposed to do, had called the number you were supposed to call, had trusted the process you were supposed to trust, and the process had been the mechanism by which her daughter had been targeted. Mercer, Voss said, I need you to understand something about the next 16 minutes. Vess has contacts. I know which ones, and I'm working to root around them. But there is a scenario, I need you to hear this, in which the first responders who arrive are not safe for you or for the girl. I know, he said. If that happens, I know, Voss. A pause. The girl is okay? Voss asked. The first time she'd asked anything that wasn't tactical. She's cold, he said. He thought about the right word. She's extraordinary, he said. Voss was quiet for a moment. 16 minutes, she said. Do not engage Vess. Do not give him a reason to make the call that puts this into the system on his terms. Hold your position. I understand. Mercer. A beat. The case I'm building on Vess, what you have in that garage right now, Cole Garrison's testimony and physical presence, the documentation I can get from this incident, it breaks the case open. Not just Vess, the network. What you're holding in there is bigger than one night in one parking garage. She paused again. I need it intact. He understood what she was saying. He understood the full shape of it. She needed Cole Garrison unharmed and in condition to testify. She needed the chain of events documented. She needed Vess to be arrested rather than, and she wasn't saying this, but the space where she wasn't saying it was very clear, rather than whatever the anger in Graves's hands had been suggesting since the moment Cole had explained what Harlan Vess was. Intact, Graves said. 16 minutes, Voss said. The line went silent. He handed the phone back to Callum and stood for a moment processing what he knew and arranging it into what he could do and what he couldn't do and the distance between those two things. Then something happened that nobody in the garage had planned for. The man from the ramp, Cole Garrison, stood up from the floor. He stood up slowly, unfolding from the position he'd been in for the past 40 minutes, and he straightened his coat, and he looked at Graves across the garage with the expression of someone who had made a decision that had no good outcome but had one better outcome than the others, and he walked toward Harlan Vess. Cole, Graves said, sharp. Cole kept walking. Priest moved to intercept him, and Cole raised one hand, not aggressive, just communicative, and said, I'm not running. I'm not making a play. Just let me go to him. Graves held Priest's shoulder for 1 second, then let go. Cole walked to Harlan Vess and stopped 5 feet away, and the two men looked at each other. Cole was a head shorter and 20 pounds lighter, and carrying the specific kind of diminishment that came from 2 years of being the face of something you couldn't look at in mirrors. Vess looked at him the way you looked at a piece of equipment. It's done, Cole said. Vess said nothing. I'm done, Cole said. Whatever happens to me from here. I can't. He stopped. Rebuilt. The girl talked about her mother, Marin with the cinnamon and dish soap, the mother who got up at 5 every morning. His voice had a quality to it now that Graves hadn't heard in it before. Not grief exactly, but the sound of something that had been encased in a specific substance for 2 years suddenly exposed to air. I have a daughter. She's 9. I haven't seen her in 8 months because the custody arrangement. It doesn't matter. She's 9. And I've been... Vess said, Cole. I'm talking, Cole said. And Vess, perhaps surprised by the specific quality of Cole's voice in that moment, stopped. I'm going to tell them everything, Cole said. Everything I know, which is one section, but it's a section that reaches other sections. And I understand what that means for me. I know what the inside of that looks like. He swallowed. But I'm done. Vess looked at him for a long moment. You understand what I can do, Vess said. Yes, Cole said. You understand that your testimony, a man with your involvement in the circumstances you're currently in, yes, Cole said. Then you understand that nothing you say tonight, I said I understand, Cole said. Quiet. Final. Like a door closing not in anger but in exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of someone who had spent 2 years holding a door open that should have been closed from the beginning. Vess looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then Vess raised his phone. Graves said, Don't. Vess looked at him. You make that call, Graves said, and the 7 months of work behind me closes around you. That's a choice. You can make it. He paused. But there's another option. Vess said nothing. 14 minutes, Graves said. Voss arrives. It gets documented correctly. The chain is intact. He paused. You know about chains. You know that one loose link can what? Enough, Vess said. Flat. Your name is in a file, Graves said. 7 months of file. Cole's testimony adds to it. The girl's testimony adds to it. What happened in this garage tonight adds to it. You make that call, you don't end the file. You just add to it. He held Vess's gaze. The call makes it worse for you, not better. You've been in this work long enough to do that math. Vess's thumb hovered over the phone screen. The garage held itself completely still. 14 minutes. And then, from outside the building, faint but unmistakable, carried through the concrete and the December air and the sleet that was still falling somewhere above, the sound of motorcycle engines. Not one, not 6, more than 6. Graves heard it the same moment Rook's head came up from where he was sitting on the hood of the car, the same moment Wade straightened from the pillar, the same moment Priest's eyes moved to the ceiling of the garage and then to the vehicle ramp. Callum said, Voss? Voss is in a car, Graves said. 16 minutes. Those are Harleys, Rook said. His voice carried the particular certainty of a man who had spent 12 years listening to that specific engine sound in all weathers and at all distances. The sound grew. 8 engines, maybe 10, settling into the low idle that meant stopped vehicles, not moving vehicles. A line of stopped vehicles on the street above the parking ramp. Harlan Vess was looking at the ramp. For the first time since he had walked into the garage, something had entered his expression that was not calculation or patience or the managed blankness of professional composure. It was the specific quality of a man looking at a variable he hadn't modeled. Who else did you call? He said to Graves. Graves looked at him. I didn't call anyone, he said. And it was true. He hadn't called anyone. Callum had called Voss, and that was the only call that had been made from this garage. The motorcycle engines idled, and then a voice came down the vehicle ramp, amplified, carrying the tinny distortion of a phone on speaker being held up to the open air. A woman's voice, controlled and precise. This is Detective Mara Voss, currently on approach. I want whoever is holding the exterior positions on this building to hear me clearly. You are being filmed from 4 separate angles on the street outside. Everything that happens in the next 10 minutes is being documented. If you are law enforcement, identify yourselves to the cameras. If you are not, I want you to think carefully about what the next 10 minutes cost you. A pause. Then, lower, in a register that was clearly not intended for the amplification, the voice said something that Graves heard only as a murmur. But the motorcycle engines on the street above revved briefly, a single coordinated pulse, like an acknowledgement. Vess's phone was still raised. His thumb was still on the screen. He looked at Graves, and Graves looked back at him and understood, in the particular lucid way that clarity arrived at the end of things that had been complex, that the next few seconds were the ones that everything in this building had been building toward, that the next few seconds would determine whether Harlan Vess made a call that turned this into a war of institutions, a long, grinding thing that chewed up everyone inside it and consumed a 7-year-old girl in the process, or whether the weight of what was accumulating on the street above, the cameras, the bikes, Voss's arrival, Cole Garrison sitting on the floor of a parking garage ready to say everything he knew, became too much for even the most constructed institutional armor to hold. And in that same moment of clarity, Graves became aware of something that he had not processed yet, that had been in the background of his attention since the motorcycle engines had started and hadn't reached the foreground until now. He recognized one of those engines. Not the sound of the group, the sound of one specific bike within the group, a 2003 Road King with a particular rattle in the secondary exhaust pipe that had been there since an incident in New Mexico 4 years ago, and that they had never fully repaired because the rider insisted it gave the bike character. That bike belonged to a man named Torres, Salvador Torres, who rode with the Copper Road chapter out of Flagstaff, who Graves had called from this same sat phone 40 minutes ago, not to ask for anything, just to say where they were in case anyone needed to know, which was standard protocol when you were 6 men in an unknown city in a situation that hadn't been planned. Torres had ridden 4 hours in December sleet with however many people he'd managed to gather on 4 hours' notice. He had not been asked to. He had simply come. Graves stood in the underground garage and felt something move through him that he did not have a clean name for. Not gratitude exactly, not relief exactly, something that was more fundamental than either of those. Something that had to do with the specific knowledge that the people you chose and who chose you would show up in the places you didn't plan to be in the weather you didn't plan for without being asked, because that was the thing the choice meant. He looked at Harlan Vess. He said, "Put the phone down." And Harlan Vess, former senior investigator, institutional architect, man who had built a shadow life inside a system designed to protect children, man who had sent a broken man named Cole Garrison to say a dead father's name to a 7-year-old girl on a playground, looked at the ramp and looked at the phone in his hand and looked at Graves. And for the first time since he had walked into this garage, he looked like what he actually was underneath all of it. A man who had run very far in a very specific direction and had just arrived at the wall at the end of it. He lowered the phone. And the moment he did, all three of his men by the SUVs looked at each other with the specific uncertainty of people whose instructions had just become ambiguous. And Cole Garrison, sitting on the floor, put his face in his hands. And Lila June Avery came out from behind the concrete pillar in the flannel shirt that reached her knees. And she walked across the garage and she stood next to Graves, and she looked at Harlan Vess with the same steady, unfrightened gaze she had turned on him 10 minutes ago when she had said her mother's name back to him like a claim. She said nothing this time. She didn't need to. Outside in the December dark, the Harleys idled and the sleet came down. And 12 minutes became 11 became 10. And somewhere in the lobby above them, a situation that had been constructed very carefully over a very long time was beginning, at last, to come apart at the seams. But not in the way anyone had planned, and not before Harlan Vess reached into his coat one final time and produced not his phone but a second device, smaller, matte black, a thing Graves had seen once before in a completely different context, in a completely different decade. And the sight of it stopped every thought in his head and replaced it with a single, absolute, ice-cold understanding of what the next 60 seconds were going to require of. The device was a dead man's switch. Graves had seen one before, once, in a condemned building in a country he still couldn't talk about, held by a man who had already decided how the situation ended and was simply communicating the terms. The design varied, but the principle didn't. A trigger held closed by the pressure of a living hand, rigged to complete a circuit the moment that pressure released. You let go, you die. Whoever was near you died. Whatever the device was connected to completed its instruction. This one was matte black and palm-sized, and Harlan Vess was holding it in his right hand with his thumb pressed flat against the top surface, and he was doing it with the specific calm of someone who had held it before, who had practiced the grip, who had known from the beginning of this evening that if the other options closed, this one was still available. Graves assessed the distance between them. 22 feet. Across open garage floor with no cover between the pillar to his left and the SUV to the right. 22 feet was manageable in many circumstances. It was not manageable in this one. He did not move. Nobody moved. "What is that connected to?" Graves said. Vess looked at the device in his hand the way you looked at something you'd carried for so long it had become part of the weight of your normal. The building's gas main was accessed through the utility corridor on the north side approximately 90 minutes ago, Vess said. The trigger closes an ignition circuit. The result is not instantaneous, it would take several seconds. But in an enclosed concrete structure, the result is sufficient. Rook said one word from where he was sitting on the car hood. "Lila." Graves was already moving. Not toward Vess, but sideways, back toward the concrete column, and he put his body between Lila and the open garage floor, and he felt her through his back, small and present and warm in the flannel shirt. "You would die," Graves said to Vess. Flat. A data point. "Yes," Vess said, simply. "And the men with you." Vess looked at his 3 men by the SUVs. They were looking back at him with expressions that suggested this particular option had not been discussed with them in advance. "Yes," Vess said. One of the 3 men by the SUV said, in a voice that had shed every pretense of professional composure, "Harlan, be quiet, Marcus," Vess said. Marcus was quiet. The man who had positioned himself as a movable institutional authority, who had spent the entire evening holding the initiative through information and patience and the architecture of institutional cover, had arrived at the place that all of that architecture had been designed to prevent, the place where none of it worked anymore. Torres's bikes on the street, Voss on approach with cameras and documentation, Cole Garrison on the floor ready to speak. The chain of custody intact in ways that couldn't be dissolved in 6 hours or 6 days. He had reached the wall, and the wall had a door in it that led somewhere none of them could follow. Graves understood all of this in the time it took to breathe twice. He also understood something else, something that arrived not from tactical assessment, but from the specific knowledge of a man who had spent 2 years grieving and 4 more years before that. Watching his daughter struggle and survive and become the person she was, he understood that Harlan Vess was not doing this from strength. I was doing it from the specific terror of a man who had spent years constructing a version of himself that could function inside what he was doing, who had engineered all the doubt and conscience out of his daily operation, and who was now standing in a parking garage holding a dead man's switch, because the alternative was watching everything he had built. The surface career, the shadow network, the years of careful institutional armor, come apart in front of a detective and a motorcycle club and a 7-year-old girl in an oversized flannel shirt. The terror of exposure was different from the terror of danger. Graves knew both. "Vess," he said. The white-haired man looked at him. "How long have you been holding that?" Graves said. A pause. "Since before I came down the ramp." "The whole conversation?" "Yes." "Then you had it the whole time we were talking," Graves said. "You had it when she—" He meant Lila. I didn't say her name. "When she stepped out and said her mother's name." Vess said nothing. "You had it when Cole said he was done," Graves said. Still nothing. "So you've been standing here this whole time with a way out in your hand," Graves said, "and you haven't used it yet." The silence that followed had a different quality from the other silences. It had space in it. "Which means you don't want to use it," Graves said. "Don't," Vess said. Quiet. Warning. "You built something," Graves said. "Years of it. And part of you, the part that's still got its thumb on that switch instead of letting go, doesn't want to burn it down to nothing." He paused. "Even now." "You don't know what I want," Vess said. "I know you walked down that ramp to talk," Graves said. "When you had that in your pocket the whole time, you walked down to talk." The sound of the Harleys on the street above had not changed. They were still idling, stationary, a low thrumming presence that came through the concrete like a second heartbeat in the building. The sleet was audible now in the silence of the garage, a thin percussion on the corrugated panels somewhere above. Lila pressed her back against Graves's spine. He felt her breathe. He made himself breathe at the same rate. Vess looked at the device in his hand. He looked at it the way Cole Garrison had looked at the floor. The way people looked at things when they were trying to locate the version of themselves that had made a series of choices, trying to find the exact point where the path had diverged, trying to understand how they had arrived at the specific geography of this moment. Wade moved, not toward Vess, parallel, 2 steps to the left, which took him further from Lila and toward the SUVs, which was not tactical in any conventional sense, but which changed the geometry of the space, which distributed the attention, which was something Wade did instinctively in the way that people with decades of field experience did things instinctively without narrating them. Marcus, the man by the SUV, looked at Wade. Wade looked back at him. "You have kids," Wade said to him. It wasn't a question. Marcus didn't answer. "Kids at home right now," Wade said. "Somewhere warmer than this." "Don't," Marcus said. "I'm just saying it," Wade said. "I'm not working an angle. I'm just saying there's a man over there holding a switch that kills everyone in this building, and you have kids at home, and I'd like you to think about that for about 30 seconds. The second of Vess's 3 men, younger than Marcus, with a face that had gone the gray-white of someone experiencing serious physical fear response, said, "He won't use it." Everyone looked at him. The young man seemed surprised to have spoken. He pressed his mouth closed. "Say that again," Graves said. The young man looked at Vess, then at Graves. Then he made the decision the way young people sometimes made decisions in rooms full of older, harder people, by simply stepping into the space that had opened rather than calculating it. "He won't use it," he said again. "I've worked 3 operations with Harlan. In 2 of them, he had an exit option like that available. He didn't use either one." He paused. He's not, he seemed to be searching for the word. "He's not that far gone." Vess said, "Jason?" "I know," Jason said. "I know what happens when I say this. I'm saying it anyway." and Vess looked at Jason with an expression that moved through several registers in rapid succession. Something close to anger, something close to the specific bewilderment of a person who had been characterized accurately at the least convenient possible moment, and then landed on something that had no clean name, something that was very old and very tired and which Graves recognized, with the particular recognition of a man who had lived long enough to see his own versions of it, as the specific expression of a person who had been fighting something internal for a very long time and had just lost the fight. Vess's arm lowered, not completely. The thumb stayed on the switch, the hand stayed closed, but the arm came down from its raised position by perhaps 10 degrees, and that 10 degrees was the difference between a posture of ultimatum and a posture of exhaustion. "Harlan," Graves said. Vess looked at him. "Put it on the floor," Graves said. "Keep your thumb on it. Set it down. You keep your thumb on it, nothing changes. You just put it down." 10 seconds. The sleet. The Harleys. Lila's back against his spine. Vess crouched slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a joint that didn't bend easily anymore, or the deliberateness of someone performing an action that they were making themselves perform one incremental degree at a time. He placed the device on the garage floor. His thumb stayed flat on the surface. He crouched over it, hand pressed down. "Good," Graves said. He looked at Priest. Priest was already moving, not toward Vess, but to the right, circling wide along the concrete wall, angling toward the position that would put him adjacent to Vess without being in front of him, without being the presence that Vess was looking at when the next thing happened. "Callum," Graves said. 9 minutes, Callum said. He had the sat phone back at his ear. 9 minutes. Graves looked at the device on the floor, and Vess crouched over it, and he ran the math. 9 minutes was possible. 9 minutes was holdable if nothing else moved. Then Marcus said, "We need to leave." Everyone looked at him. He was looking at Vess. His voice had the quality of someone who had been quiet long enough that the pressure of what was behind the quiet had finally become greater than the pressure of maintaining it. "Harlan," he said, "we need to leave. Right now. We walk up the ramp, we get in vehicles. We're in another state in 4 hours. Whatever's coming, the detective, the testimony, it takes time to build. We have time. We use it right now and we leave." Vess looked at him from his crouch on the floor. "Marcus," he said. "Quiet." "I have a family," Marcus said. "I have people. I did not sign on for this." He gestured at the garage, at the device on the floor, at all of it. "I did this for the money and the access, and I understood the risk, but this—" Another gesture. "This is not what I agreed to." "What did you agree to?" Wade said. "From 10 feet away? Still level, still without heat." Marcus looked at him. "Whatever you thought you agreed to," Wade said. "The children on the other end of it didn't agree to anything." He let that sit. "Just want to make sure we're mapping this accurately." Marcus looked at the floor. The third man, the one who hadn't spoken, who had stood by the SUV the entire time with the stillness of someone who had made his internal assessment early and was waiting for the external situation to catch up to it, sat down on the garage floor. He sat down slowly, deliberately, cross-legged, and he put his hands on his knees and he looked at Graves. "I'm done," he said, quietly, with the specific quality of done that Cole Garrison had used. Not dramatic, not performative, just the statement of a limit that had been reached. The dominoes of it moved through the garage in the silence that followed. Marcus looked at the man on the floor, then at Vess, then at Graves. Then he sat down next to the man on the floor. Jason had already been standing apart from the other two. He stayed standing, but his hands came up, visible, open, and he held them there at shoulder height and looked at Rook, who was closest to him, with the expression of someone who had already made his choice a few minutes ago and was simply making it visible. Vess was watching all of this from his crouch on the floor. His thumb was still on the device. His back was to Graves now. He had turned slightly to watch his men. And Graves was aware of Priest's position against the wall to Vess's right, and aware of the device on the floor, and aware that the geometry of the room had shifted in ways that were either an opportunity or a trap, depending on what Vess decided in the next 10 seconds. "Harlan," Graves said. Vess didn't respond. "It's done," Graves said. "Your people are done. Cole is done. Voss is 8 minutes out with cameras on the building." He paused. "You put that switch on the floor and kept your thumb on it. That means something. You came down the ramp and talked for 40 minutes when you didn't have to talk. That means something too. Don't, Vess said. His voice had changed. The professional composure was gone. What was left was rougher, less finished, like the surface had been worn down to the structure beneath it. You chose this work originally, Graves said. Not the shadow work. The other work. Child Services Oversight. You chose it for a reason. Stop, Vess said. What was the reason? I said stop. What was the reason, Harlan? The silence stretched, and then, from the direction of the stairwell, two things happened simultaneously. The stairwell door burst open with a force that sent it into the wall with a sound like a gunshot, and Graves's hand came up even as his mind processed that it was Dutch. Dutch coming through the door fast with his arm around someone, supporting someone, a figure that Graves needed 2 full seconds to identify because the figure was moving wrong, weight wrong, face wrong, with the specific wrongness of someone who had taken a significant impact. It was Callum. Not the Callum who had been standing 10 feet away with the sat phone. The Callum was still there. Graves registered this in the peripheral. This was someone who looked enough like Callum to require 2 seconds of processing, and those 2 seconds resolved into the understanding that this was not Callum, but was instead a young woman, maybe 20, with dark hair and a face that was streaming blood from a cut above her eyebrow, wearing a jacket with a press credential clipped to it. Dutch got her to the nearest car hood, and she gripped the edge of it and looked up, and the blood ran down her face, and she said, "There are more coming, down Meridian. They were waiting 2 blocks out. I counted 7 vehicles. I got the plates before they—" She touched her head and looked at the blood on her fingers with the faintly distant expression of someone in mild shock. "They were waiting for a signal. They've been waiting this whole time." Graves looked at Callum, the actual Callum. "What signal?" Callum had the sat phone raised. "Voss says the same. Her unit is picking up movement 2 blocks north. 7 vehicles, mixed civilian and law enforcement markings." He paused. 4 minutes. 4 minutes until Voss arrived. 7 vehicles 2 blocks away waiting for a signal. The signal that Vess had not yet sent. The signal that required Vess to lift his thumb. Graves understood it in the same moment he understood that Vess understood it. That the dead man's switch was not primarily an exit. It was a door. Lift the thumb, the circuit closed, the ignition completed, and in the chaos of a structure fire in a parking garage on a December night, 7 vehicles could move through the chaos and disappear with whatever they needed to disappear with, including a 7-year-old girl in a yellow dress. He had been looking at it from the wrong angle the entire time. "Vess," Graves said. "Don't come toward me," Vess said. Sharp. The composure was gone, and what was under it was raw and tired and frightened and something else. Something that had been held back the entire night and was now very close to the surface. "I'm not moving," Graves said. He wasn't. He was standing exactly where he'd been, with Lila behind him, his body between her and Vess and the device on the floor and the garage floor and every calculation he could run. "I'm asking you to hear what I'm saying. Those 7 vehicles move on this building, everything changes. Voss arrives into a fire scene, she can't document anything, she can't protect testimony, she can't—" He stopped. "Rebuilt. The case on you disappears, 7 months of work. Into the fire." Vess said nothing. "But the children don't disappear," Graves said. "The one's already gone. They're not in the file. They're not documentation." He paused. "Cole said he didn't know how many. You know how many." "Don't," Vess said. The word came out ragged. "You know every name," Graves said. "You pulled every intake file. You did the selection. You know every name, and the only way any of them ever comes back, the only way any of them ever gets found, is if the chain stays intact, if Cole speaks, if the documentation holds, if Voss arrives to a garage instead of a fire." He let the silence hold for one breath. "You blow this building, you take that with you. Every name you know goes with you, and nobody ever finds them." The device stayed on the floor, Vess's thumb stayed on the surface, but something had changed in his shoulders. In the specific geometry of how he was holding himself crouched over the device on the floor. The rigidity had shifted into something else. Not softness, nothing so clean as that. The particular quality of a structure that had been under load for a very long time and had just felt the load shift. Rook said, from the car hood, his voice rough with the concussive headache but steady. "You're the only one who knows all of it. Everything below you in the chain, you're the only one who can see across all of it. You die in this garage. Whatever you know dies with you." Priest had gotten close, very close, within 8 feet of Vess along the wall, moving at the pace of something geological. He stopped. "Harlan," Priest said, "one word." The way Priest used one word, with all the weight of 61 years of seeing what people did when they were at their limit. Vess looked at Priest. "You're tired," Priest said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't pity. It was just an observation, delivered in the voice of someone who recognized the specific topography of exhaustion from the inside, who had inhabited it themselves in different forms, and who was offering the recognition not as weakness, but as fact. Vess looked at Priest for a long time. Then he looked at the device on the floor. Then he looked across the garage, past the SUVs, past his own men sitting on the floor, past Cole Garrison, with his face in his hands, past all of it, to the concrete pillar where Lila had been hidden, and where she was no longer hidden because she had come out from behind it and was standing in the flannel shirt in her bare feet, looking at him, not with fear, not with hatred, with the specific quality of attention that she brought to everything, focused, honest, not looking away. Vess looked at her for what felt like a very long time and was probably 6 seconds. And then he moved his thumb, not lifting it, shifting it, sliding it sideways along the surface of the device in a motion that Graves didn't understand for a fraction of a second, and then understood completely as the device made a small mechanical sound and the light on its side, on which had been a steady red, went dark. A safety mechanism. A secondary lock. He had engaged the safety. The circuit was broken at the source. Graves felt the release of it move through the garage like a pressure change. The specific atmospheric shift of a room in which everyone has been holding a breath they weren't fully aware of holding. Vess stayed crouched on the floor for a moment. Then he put the device on the concrete and he sat down beside it. And he put his hands on his knees and he looked at nothing in particular and he said, in a voice that was very quiet and very flat, and which Graves would think about for a long time afterward, 17. Nobody spoke. 17 children, Vess said. In 14 months, this region. He paused. There are other regions. The number entered the garage and stayed there. Graves stood with it. He stood with it the way you stood with the weight of numbers that were not abstract, that were each a specific child with a specific face and a specific mother and a specific name, that were each a person who had been inside the system that was supposed to protect them and had instead been inside the mechanism that located them for people who had a use for them. 17. He thought of Lila on the playground. He thought of a dead man's name used as a key. He thought of Marin Avery getting up at 5 in the morning to open a diner that was barely surviving and smelling like cinnamon and dish soap and being the entire world to a girl who had already lost one parent and who had picked up the phone 8 months ago to ask for help. He thought of Maya. He thought of 17. He breathed. "Callum," he said. His voice came out even. He was almost surprised. "Voss is 90 seconds out," Callum said. "Tell her what she's walking into." "Already on it." Graves walked to Vess. He stood in front of the man, the crouching, diminished, white-haired man who had held the room for 2 hours and now held nothing. And he looked down at him and Vess looked up at him. "Stand up," Graves said. Vess stood. He was several inches shorter than Graves. He looked, standing this close, much older than he had looked from across the garage. The institutional composure was entirely gone. What was there instead was the face of a man who had arrived at the specific geography of no return and had, at the last possible moment, chosen not to detonate. "The 17, Graves said. "You're going to give Voss everything you have, every name, every node, every contact, every route." He paused. "Every child you can still locate." Vess said nothing. "Every one," Graves said. "Some of them," Vess began. "Everyone you can still locate," Graves said, flat, final. "You do that, and what happens to you after is between you and Voss and the system. But you do that first." "And if I don't?" Vess said. Old reflex, old language. "Then you stood in front of a 7-year-old girl tonight," Graves said, "and you heard her say her mother's name, and you still—" He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Vess looked at him. Then he nodded once. The sound of vehicle doors above, fast, multiple, and then boots on the ramp, fast, controlled, professional, and Mara Voss came down the vehicle ramp with 3 agents behind her and a 4th on a radio, and she took in the garage in the systematic sweep of someone who had prepared for something bad and found something different. She found Harlan Vess standing with his hands at his sides. She found 3 men sitting on the floor and one standing with his hands raised. She found Cole Garrison sitting with his face in his hands, and a young journalist being treated for a head wound, and Rook on the hood of a car holding his jaw, and 6 men in leather who looked like they'd been inside something difficult for a very long time. And she found a girl in an oversized flannel shirt, barefoot, who was standing in the middle of it all, looking at the detective with the same calm, focused attention she brought to everything. Voss looked at Graves. He looked back at her. "She's okay," he said. Voss let out a breath. Then she looked at Vess, and her face shifted into something professional and cold, and she said, "Harlan Vess, I have a federal warrant." And the words continued, and the agents moved toward Vess and the 3 men on the floor, and Callum was talking to someone on the sat phone, and Dutch was back at the journalist's head wound with a field kit he'd produced from somewhere. And Rook was standing now, testing his weight, and Wade was at the base of the ramp talking to the additional agents coming down, and Priest was standing near the center of the garage with his arms crossed, watching everything, the way Priest always watched everything, comprehensively and quietly, storing it in the place where old men stored the things that needed to be carried. Graves turned away from all of it. He walked to Lila. She was still standing where she'd been when Vess nodded. She was looking at him with an expression he recognized, not from any specific person, but from the specific emotional register that arrived at the end of things that had been survivable but had required everything you had to survive them when the body finally permitted itself to process what had happened. Her chin was shaking. "Okay," he said, quiet, just to her. "You're okay." She pressed her lips together, held it. Then she stepped forward and wrapped both arms around his waist and pressed her face against his chest, and the shaking moved through her in waves, controlled and deep and real, the way real things always arrived. Not dramatically, not cleanly, but in the body, honest and unstoppable and entirely human. He put his arms around her. Outside on Meridian Street, the Harleys idled in the December dark, and the sleet came down, and the 7 vehicles 2 blocks north that had been waiting for a signal slowly, one by one, began to move. Not toward the building, but away from it, as the police frequencies came alive with Voss's authorization codes, and the street coverage collapsed, and the night, which had been constructed very carefully by one man over a very long time, finally came apart, the way constructed things always did. Not in a single dramatic failure, but in the accumulated weight of 17 names said out loud in a parking garage by a man who was too tired to carry them alone anymore. And Graves stood in the underground garage in Harrow Creek with a 7-year-old girl holding on to him, and he thought of Maya, and for the first time in 4 years the thought of her did not arrive as only grief. It arrived as something else. Something he did not yet have a word for, but which felt, in the exhausted, concrete-cold, red-lit aftermath of the worst night he had not planned for, like the specific thing that made it possible to keep going, and which he recognized, only now, only here, had been present in every difficult thing he had ever moved through, waiting for him to be still enough to... The word arrived in the moment after everything stopped. Not a word from anyone in the garage. Not from Voss, who was still moving through the space with her agents, coordinating, documenting, her voice a steady low frequency of professional instruction. Not from the men on the floor. Not from Vess, who was standing with his wrists in restraints and his eyes on the middle distance with the specific expression of a man who had already begun the long interior work of living inside what he'd done. The word came from inside Graves. It arrived the way the most important things always arrived. Not announced, not dramatized, just present suddenly, the way warmth was present when you came in from the cold. He was standing in the underground garage with Lila's arms around his waist and her face against his chest, and the word was simply enough. Not enough as in sufficient. Enough as in this. Here. The weight of her, real and small and alive, pressing into him. The sound of the Harleys on the street above still idling like a pulse. The smell of concrete and cold air, and the distant faint trace of diesel that always clung to the inside of parking structures. Enough as in the present moment, exactly as it was, without needing to be anything else. He had not felt that in 4 years. He stood in it for a few seconds and let it be true. Then Lila pulled back and looked up at him and said, "I want my mom." "I know," "Oh," he said. "Can we call her?" He looked at Callum, who was already holding the sat phone out. Marin Avery answered on the second ring with the voice of a woman who had been awake since her daughter didn't come home from the playground, raw and compressed and stripped of everything except the core frequency of maternal fear. Graves handed the phone down to Lila. He stepped away to give her distance. He walked to the base of the vehicle ramp and stood there in the cold air coming down from the street and listened to Lila's voice behind him change, soften, crack, fill with the specific kind of crying that was not distress, but its opposite, the release of held tension through the safest possible conduit. And he looked at the concrete wall and breathed. Voss appeared beside him. She was 43, compact, with close-cropped hair, and the kind of face that had been trained over years of investigative work to reveal only what she chose to reveal. Right now she was choosing to reveal something that was not quite professional, which was the only way he knew the night had cost her something too. "You held this together," she said. "We held it," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Vess is talking," she said. "Started before we had him in the vehicle. Names, routes, contacts. It's going to take weeks to process what he gives us." She paused. "He asked one thing." Graves waited. "He asked if the 17 could be found," she said. "Not as a negotiation, not as a trade. He asked it the way someone asked a question they already knew they had no right to ask." She paused again. "I told him we'd use everything he gave us." "And?" "Some of them can be found," she said, quietly, with the weight of the ones the sentence didn't include. "Not all, but some." The word "some" sat between them in the cold air, and they both looked at it, and neither of them looked away from it. "The journalist," Graves said, "Clara Reeves. She'd been following Vess for 2 months on her own. A tip from a social worker who'd noticed anomalies in intake records. She came to the building tonight because she tracked the signal block to this address." Voss almost smiled. 22 years old. Graves thought about 22 and what you were at 22 and what it cost to go somewhere alone at night because you had followed something that needed following. "Dutch took care of her head," he said. "I know. She'll be okay." Voss looked at him directly. "Cole Garrison's testimony combined with what she has and what Vess is giving us, it's enough. It's more than enough." She paused. "It takes down the network. Not just this node. The network. The thing that had existed under the surface of the system that was supposed to prevent it, that had used the system's own access and records as its mechanism, that had moved for years through the spaces where institutional authority was not questioned because questioning it required someone to look closely, and no one had looked closely enough for long enough, until now. "Your club," Voss said. "The ones on the street." "Torres," Graves said. "Copper Road chapter. He'll have brought whoever was close enough to ride in 4 hours. I'm going to need to take statements." "They'll give them." Voss nodded. She looked down the ramp toward the garage floor where Lila was still on the phone, sitting on the floor now with her back against a concrete pillar and her knees up and the flannel shirt wrapped around her, talking in the lower, calmer register that came after the first wave. "She's something," Voss said. "Yeah," Graves said. Voss put her hand briefly on his arm, not a gesture that required acknowledgement, just a physical statement of something that words would have overstated. And then she went back to work. Graves went back to the girl. The statements took 3 hours. They took them in the lobby of the building, which was warm and fluorescent, and which had been cleared of Vess's people, and now contained federal agents with recording equipment and cups of bad coffee from a machine in the corner that charged $1.50 for something that tasted like heated brown water. Graves drank 2 cups. He didn't taste either of them. He answered questions in the flat, precise, chronologically ordered way he had learned to give accounts, from the combat debrief structure that was still, 25 years later, the cleanest way he knew to move through the narration of events that had been chaotic in experience but needed to be coherent in the telling. Rook was evaluated by paramedics who confirmed Dutch's field assessment and told him to rest for 48 hours and take something for the headache. Rook said he would. He would not, and everyone present understood this, but the statement satisfied the paramedics. Lila sat with a female agent named Carrera. who had a daughter of her own and who sat with Lila at a table in the corner with a paper cup of hot chocolate from somewhere and asked her questions in the careful, unhurried way of someone who had been trained to do this and who also genuinely cared, which was a combination that Lila responded to with the same focused honesty she brought to everything. At 2:40 in the morning, headlights came through the lobby glass. A small, dark blue sedan that was not new and was not expensive, and which had a dent in the rear passenger door that had never been repaired. The car stopped and a woman got out, and she was still wearing what appeared to be a diner apron over a winter coat, which meant she had left the moment Callum's call reached her and had not stopped for anything except the coat, and her hair was pulled back in the hasty way of someone who had done it in the car at a red light, and her face was the face of a woman who had been running on the specific fuel of maternal terror for 6 hours and was now using the last of it to get through the lobby doors. Lila saw her through the glass before the door opened. She was off the chair before anyone could speak. The lobby door opened and Maren Avery came through it, and Lila crossed the distance between them at the particular velocity of a 7-year-old who has been holding herself together for 6 hours and has just been given permission to stop. And the sound Maren made when she caught her daughter was not a word. It was something before words, something the body made when it received back something it had understood it might not receive back. Graves looked away. He looked at the wall and drank the cold bad coffee and let it be private. After a while, Maren Avery crossed the lobby to where he was standing. She was 34. She had the hands of someone who worked with them, red at the knuckles, calloused at the palms, and the eyes of someone who had been sleeping badly for longer than one night. She was not beautiful in any curated sense. She was entirely, specifically, recognizably real. She looked at him. She didn't speak for a moment. "Lila told me," she said finally, as much as she could. She stopped. Her jaw worked around something. "She said you told her the truth. When she asked if your man upstairs was going to get hurt, she said you told her you didn't know." "I didn't know," Graves said. "She said that was when she trusted you completely," Maren said, "because you didn't pretend." He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. Not in the way people said it when they meant it generically. In the way people said it when it was the smallest container available for something that didn't fit in any container. He nodded. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have been less than what she'd already said, so he didn't try. Torres and his people were waiting outside. 14 bikes in total. Torres had called everyone within a 200-mile radius who had a Harley and a reason to move. And the reasons varied, but the response had not. They were standing in the December sleet in their colors and their leather, some of them people Graves knew well, and some of them people he knew only by name and reputation. And they were drinking coffee from a gas station across the street and talking in the low, unhurried way of people who had ridden through bad weather to get somewhere and had arrived, and were now in the specific post-arrival state of waiting for what came next. Torres was 51 and built like something that had survived considerable weather, which he had. He had a gray streak in his beard that hadn't been there 2 years ago, and he'd put on some weight at the shoulders that he'd lost at the jaw. And he handed Graves a gas station coffee without being asked, and said nothing for a moment. 4 hours, Graves said. 3.5, Torres said. Hit clear road after Millbrook. Sleet the whole way? Most of it. Graves looked at the 14 bikes lined along the street and the 14 men and 2 women standing with them, and the specific quality of presence they had. Not dramatic. Not performing anything, just there, the way things were there that had decided to be there regardless. I didn't ask you, Graves said. No, Torres said. You came anyway. You called and told me where you were, Torres said. That's asking. Graves looked at him. That's how it works, Torres said, simply, as if explaining something obvious to someone who had somehow forgotten it. Graves looked at the street, at the sleet coming down in the pool of a streetlight, at the 14 bikes with their chrome catching the light, and the condensation of 14 people's breath in the cold air, and the sound somewhere in the distance of Harrow Creek, continuing to be a mid-sized town that most people had never heard of, going about its 4 in the morning version of itself, indifferent to what had happened in a parking garage on Meridian Street. He thought about the 17 children. He thought about the ones who could be found and the ones who couldn't. He thought about Cole Garrison, who was somewhere in a federal vehicle now beginning the long process of saying everything he knew. Not because he was brave, but because he was tired. and sometimes tired was enough. Sometimes the thing that broke you open was simply the accumulated weight of everything you'd been carrying and a 7-year-old girl saying her mother's name with authority in a garage in December. He thought about Harlan Vess, who had built a shadow life inside the architecture of protection, and who had stood in a parking garage with a dead man's switch and had chosen, at the last possible second, not to be only what he'd become. Not redemption, nothing so clean, just the last functional remnant of something that had once been different, making one final decision in the direction it had originally been pointed. He thought about Maya, who had called him twice the night before her interview because she was nervous, and who had known, the way daughters knew, that he would answer regardless of the hour. He thought about Lila, who had picked the biggest, roughest, most dangerous-looking men in a parking garage and had trusted them completely because she was 7 years old and had not yet learned to mistake the shape of protection for the shape of threat. He hoped she would never learn that. He was not naive enough to believe she wouldn't, but he hoped. 3 months later, the Ashen Saints rode back into Harrow Creek. They came on a Saturday morning in March when the sleet had been replaced by a cold, clean light that came through thin clouds and made everything look slightly more deliberate than usual. The storefronts and the bare trees and the street that they'd last seen in December, dark now visible in the specific clarity of early spring. They came because Callum had gotten a letter, handwritten, on paper that had been folded 3 times and addressed to the Ashen Saints, in the careful, round, still-developing script of a 7-year-old who knew how to spell every word she'd used and had checked them. The letter said that Daniel's Roadhouse had a new sign and new paint, and that her mom had fixed the diner leak that had been a problem since fall, and that she had started 2nd grade, and her teacher's name was Miss Okafor, and she liked her, and that she had drawn something she wanted them to have. They parked outside the diner on Culver Street, and the engines went quiet one by one, and the street was not afraid of the sound the way it had been in December. People looked, you looked when 14 Harleys parked outside a diner at 9 in the morning. But the looking was different now. The kind of looking that was curiosity rather than withdrawal. Marin Avery was at the door before they reached it. She looked like she'd slept. Not fully, not completely. She would not fully sleep for some time, and everyone in the vicinity of what had happened understood that without it needing to be said. But she had slept, and her eyes were clear, and she was wearing a clean apron over her regular clothes, and she was holding the door open with the particular expression of someone who had been waiting for this and was not going to pretend otherwise. "I made food," she said. "You didn't have to," Torres began. "I made food," she said again, in the tone of someone for whom this was not an offer, but a statement of established fact, and Torres went inside. The diner smelled like cinnamon and dish soap and fresh coffee, and something with bacon in it and the warmth of it. After the March morning air was the specific warmth of enclosed spaces where people had been working since before daylight to make things ready for other people. Lila was at a table near the window. She was in a red sweater and her hair was braided, and she had in front of her a piece of paper that she had been holding flat with both hands as if it might escape. And when Graves came through the door, she looked up and her face did the thing it did, the focused, recalibrating assessment. And then she held out the paper. He crossed the diner and took it. It was a drawing in crayon. 6 motorcycles arranged in a circle, rendered in the particular way of children's drawings, where the essential truth of the thing was captured without any of the incidental details. So the bikes were clearly bikes, and the circle they formed was clearly intentional. A ring, a shield. In the center of the ring, a small yellow shape that was a girl. Around the outside of the ring, small red marks that might have been flames, or might have been something else entirely. At the bottom, in the careful checked spelling of someone who took words seriously, "The monsters were scared of you." I wasn't. Graves looked at the drawing for a long time. He was aware of the diner around him, the sound of his people finding chairs, of Marin pouring coffee without being asked, of Rook saying something quietly to Wade that made Wade exhale through his nose in the way he did when something was true and also cost something. He was aware of the cinnamon smell and the light coming through the window and Lila watching him from the other side of the table. He folded the drawing carefully. He put it in the inside pocket of his vest, next to where he kept the photograph of Maya. He looked at Lila. "Thank you," he said. She considered this. "You said thank you wrong," she said. "How should I say it?" She thought about it seriously. "You should say it like you mean it more than the words." He looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," he said again. She nodded, satisfied. Outside on Culver Street, the 14 Harleys sat in the March light, and the new sign above the diner read Daniel's Roadhouse in clean dark paint, and the town of Harrow Creek went about its Saturday morning, and inside men who had ridden 400 miles in 3.5 hours through December sleet, because someone they trusted had called to say where they were, sat in a diner that smelled like cinnamon and ate food made by a woman who had gotten up before daylight to make it, and drank coffee. That was nothing like the gas station version and said very little because very little needed to be said. Graves drank his coffee. It was the best thing he'd tasted in 4 years. He sat with that, not analyzing it, not naming it, just sitting with it the way you sat with things that were true and did not require anything more from you than to acknowledge them. At the table across from him, Lila was showing Priest her drawing of the biker circle, explaining each motorcycle in turn, which one was which, naming them by some system only she fully understood. Priest listened with the complete attention he brought to everything, unhurried, without performance. And when she finished, he asked one question about the red marks on the outside of the circle. "What are those?" he said. Lila looked at the drawing. "Warnings," she said. "For the next monsters." Priest looked at the drawing for a moment. Then he looked at Graves across the diner with the expression of someone who had just received a piece of information that confirmed something they'd suspected but hadn't been certain of. Graves looked back at him. Priest nodded once. The Harleys sat in the light outside, and the coffee was warm, and the morning moved at the pace of mornings that had earned their slowness, and somewhere in the machinery of the justice system that Maravos was feeding with 7 months of files, and Cole Garrison's testimony, and the account of a 22-year-old journalist who had followed something because it needed to be followed, 17 names were being spoken aloud in rooms where the right people were finally listening, and some of those names were being matched to children who were being located, one by one, in the patient and unglamorous work of finding what had been lost. Not all of them, but some. Some was not enough. Some was what there was. And the men who had been inside that parking garage on a December night, they hadn't planned for sat in a warm diner in March, and understood, without saying it, that some was what you kept working from. That the work did not end because the night ended. That you rode back. That you showed up. That you kept the photograph in the inside pocket, and you drank the coffee, and you let a 7-year-old girl explain her drawings to you, and you let the warmth of an enclosed space after a cold morning be what it was. Enough. Not enough as in sufficient. Enough as in here. This. The only place where the next thing was possible. Outside, the light moved through the clouds and came down on Culver Street, and on the bikes lined up in front of the diner with its new sign, and the engines were quiet, and the town was quiet, and for the first time since December, Gideon Mercer was quiet too. Not the hollow quiet of grief, not the pressurized quiet of a man managing something he couldn't put down, but the other quiet. The one that came after. The one that meant you were still here, and the morning was still here, and there was coffee, and there was work, and somewhere a girl in a red sweater was explaining the system of warnings she'd drawn in crayon around the people who had stood between her and the dark. And the sound of it, her voice, precise and serious and alive, was the most ordinary and necessary sound